Bush heavily committed to the UN. Powell's repetitious enthusiasm for the UN and NATO faithfully mirrored the attitude of the president who had appointed him. On March 23, 2001, while welcoming UN Secretary General Kofi Annan to the White House, Mr. Bush gushed, "My administration thinks he's doing an excellent job as the Secretary General of the United Nations, and therefore we heartily endorse his second term as the Secretary General." But the man whose work Mr. Bush described as excellent happens to be a determined foe of national sovereignty. In a speech to the UN General Assembly on September 18, 1999, Annan stated, "State sovereignty in its most basic sense is being redefined by the forces of globalization and international cooperation." In the same address, he labeled traditional notions of sovereignty as an obstacle to UN plans for the world. Annan's attitude is only one of many reasons why our nation should withdraw from the UN. But rather than see danger ahead for our nation because of the Secretary General's attitude, Mr. Bush chose to praise the man and the organization he leads. Annan's predecessor, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, expressed similar content for national independence in his January 1992 An Agenda for Peace. Said Boutros-Ghali, "The time of absolute and exclusive sovereignty, however, has passed. Its theory was never matched by reality." Statements of other UN leaders are equally revealing of their antipathy toward the independence of nations. But nothing they say or do deters US leaders from praising both them and the UN. Mr. Bush then made good on his pledge to provide $582 million in dues payments to the world body. In a carefully prepared statement, he claimed, "This release of funds will enhance the close bond between the United Nations and the United States." When he proclaimed United Nations Day on October 24, 2001, Mr. Bush urged all Americans to pause and reflect on the noble history of the United Nations and to praise its many contributions towards providing a better quality of life. History repeatedly shows, however, that the UN's contributions include dignifying bloody-handed tyrants, attacking the independence of nations, and building power for itself over virtually every aspect of life on Earth. In May 2001, the UN removed the U.S. from its Human Rights Commission in favor of Sudan, officially designated as a sponsor of terrorism by our own government. Then, as of January 1, 2002, Syria, also named as a sponsor of terrorism by the U.S. State Department, ended up with a seat on the UN Security Council, with a Syrian even serving as the Council's president in August 2003. Yet Mr. Bush had no trouble praising the world body for its noble history. One day after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on America, Mr. Bush turned to the United Nations and NATO for authority to launch military action against Afghanistan. On September 28, the UN's Resolution 1373, sponsored by the United States, authorized the attack on Afghanistan's Taliban government and the al-Qaeda terrorist network. Then, on November 10, 2001, in a speech delivered at UN headquarters, Mr. Bush pointed to Resolution 1373 and stated, "The most basic obligations in the new conflict have already been defined by the United Nations." He added that all nations must pass necessary laws to meet the requirements spelled out in this comprehensive UN resolution. America's insiders were deftly citing UN authority as justification for imposing totalitarian control over Americans in the name of fighting terrorism. Not surprisingly, the Bush administration would soon present the necessary legislation to comply with the UN resolution it had sponsored. Revelation of one of the frightening plans for centralizing powers over all Americans led New York Times columnist William Safire to protest. Every purchase you make with a credit card, every magazine subscription you buy, every medical prescription you fill, every website you visit, every email you send or receive, every text you send or receive, every academic grade you receive, every bank deposit you make, every trip you book, every event you attend, all these transactions and communications will go into what the Defense Department describes as a virtual centralized grand database. To this computerized dossier of your private life from commercial sources, Add every piece of information that the government has about you: tax information, passport application, driver's license and bridge toll records, judicial and divorce records, complaints from nosy neighbors to FBI records, your lifetime paper trail, plus the latest hidden camera surveillance, and you have the Super Snoop's dream, the total information awareness. And they have that about every U.S. citizen. The Total Information Awareness, or TIA program mentioned by Sapphire, it's an electronic counterpart of the proposed Terrorism and Information Prevention System, or TIPS, under which mail carriers, meter readers, delivery men, neighbors, and others would be encouraged to report on the activities of ordinary citizens. This is a Soviet-style watchfulness over a supposedly free people. Congress blocked the TIPS portion of the plan after an outcry from the American people, but potential remains for it to surface again. On December 19, 2001, Mr. Bush proudly announced via a 25-page letter to the UN that our nation had complied with the body of legally binding obligations on all UN member states. The UN, therefore, now dictates alterations in U.S. law. The notification of compliance acknowledged the creation of the UN's new Counterterrorism Committee, which is called the CTC. One of the obligations agreed to by the U.S. leaders led to the enactment of the USA Patriot Act that circumvents the U.S. Constitution by expanding federal powers into the areas of surveillance, search, and arrest. Early in 2003, the administration proposed the Patriot Act II that would, among other features, further trash protections guaranteed in the Bill of Rights and expand government power to issue top-secret warrants against American citizens suspected of broadly defined terrorist activity. The important point here is that the resolution represented by the U.S. and passed by the UN created the UN CTC that binds governments, including ours, to programs that dilute personal freedom and destroy limited government in the name of opposing terrorism. Conversion of our nation into a subdivision of the UN, while completely ignoring the U.S. Constitution, is the long-standing goal of the insiders. It is an undeniable goal of the Bush administration as well. If protecting our nation were the real goal, our leaders would state clearly that Homeland Security, it doesn't exist as long as the borders remain open. And since they're really not addressing this as an obvious problem, their motives in enacting the new legislation remain suspect. Now, keep in mind, this was written in 2004, and we do see our current administration addressing this issue. It's a very serious issue. And if you don't believe it is, spend a day in a border town. All right, moving on, the CFR's hand in Homeland Security. The 9/11 terrorist attacks were also seized as a pretext to implement standing insider plans for a major shift in the federal balance of power. Plans for an enormous new federal agency sprung from a 1998 commission formed at the urging of President Bill Clinton and former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Over the ensuing 3-year period, commission leaders Warren Rudman and Gary Hart worked with Leslie Gelb, Lee Hamilton, and James Schlesinger to produce what is essentially the legislation that was given to Congress for its approval. Each of the 7 men just named is a CFR member, and at the time, Gelb was the reigning CFR president. The Commission's work, which proposed the creation of a new independent National Homeland Security Agency, was presented to President Bush and his cabinet on January 31st, over 7 months prior to 9/11. When the 9/11 attacks occurred, the Commission's recommendations became the subject of a special meeting held at the CFR's branch in Washington on September 14, 2001. 6 days later, President Bush announced his administration's plans to create the new Office of Homeland Security, implementing the first phase of the Commission's recommendations. Immediately after being named by Mr. Bush to lead the Office of Homeland Security, Pennsylvania Governor Tom Ridge announced that he would create a national strategy, not a federal strategy, that would include steps towards centralizing authority over state and local police forces and militarizing law enforcement functions. These practices, commonly seen in totalitarian states, were widely scorned by our nation's founders and have not been seriously considered during our nation's entire existence. National police forces, like those made famous in Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, they still exist in communist-dominated China, Cuba, and North Korea. They have as their purposes the protection of the government from the people. Local police forces, however, are the complete opposite. They exist to protect the people from any force that would harm them or destroy their liberties. The difference cannot be overstated. The following year, Congress dutifully gave the Department of Homeland Security cabinet-level status, representing a huge consolidation of power and personnel. Mr. Bush had stated that the most basic obligations he felt compelled to meet had been defined by the United Nations. A more honest statement would have informed the American people that those obligations had been defined by the Council on Foreign Relations. Following the European Union model. Destroying national sovereignty has always been the insider's goal. Military, political, and economic entanglements constitute various routes to achieve the same end. What works well elsewhere for the plotters becomes policy in the United States. Over the past several decades, Europeans have seen their once independent nations become trapped in the European Union. Many have learned to their horror that the economic union, originally sold as a road to economic prosperity through the easing of trade barriers and travel, was actually the initial step toward political union and loss of sovereignty. From the beginning, the ultimate goal of these who promised only financial rewards was always world government. Now the process that has worked so well in Europe is being promoted by insiders in the United States, with President Bush leading the charge. Americans should have seen the danger ahead of them years before when President Clinton and fellow CFR member Henry Kissinger eagerly promoted U.S. approval of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Kissinger made no attempt to cloak the real goal of this pact when he said it will represent the most creative step toward a new world order taken by any group of countries since the end of the Cold War. Not a conventional trade agreement, but the architecture of the new international system. As predicted by opponents, however, NAFTA quickly demanded changes in U.S. law. For example, legislation limiting the number of trucks entering our nation from Mexico and requiring inspections of their cargoes came under attack by Mexican authorities, citing NAFTA. Because the U.S. had agreed to the pact, our leaders dutifully changed our laws. Sovereignty had been compromised. Then, on January 8, 1998, the Dallas Morning News pointed to uninspected Mexican trucks as the conduit for a sharp increase in heroin traffic within our nation. Other NAFTA-imposed requirements have followed. In November 2003, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce referenced a report compiled by the Non-Government Economic Policy Institute that documented the loss of almost 900,000 American jobs as a result of NAFTA. Similarly, when Mr. Clinton of the CFR and Newt Gingrich of the CFR campaigned to have Congress approve U.S. entry into the World Trade Organization, or WTO, another attack on U.S. sovereignty should have been detected. Gingrich himself stated that joining the World Trade Organization would amount to a big transfer of power, a transformational moment. Just as with NAFTA, it wasn't long before the Geneva-based WTO demanded changes in our nation's tax policies under a threat of sanctions and fines. Fines are bad enough, but WTO-imposed sanctions would require other WTO nations to institute boycotts against any targeted nation. Congressman Ron Paul from Texas, a Republican, he rightly claimed that the real effect of membership in the WTO had little to do with so-called trade benefits, but plenty to do with our nation's sovereignty. He claimed we should never deliver to any international governing body the authority to dictate what our laws should be. But the attack on U.S. sovereignty continued when WTO ruled in March 2003 that the U.S. steel tariffs are illegal. In 1993, when he was urging Congress to approve NAFTA, CFR heavyweight Henry Kissinger looked ahead and forecast a Western Hemisphere-wide free trade system with NAFTA as the first step. Almost a decade later, President Bush would champion the creation of a free trade area of the Americas, the next step in the insider agenda. The planned FTAA will cost all Western Hemisphere nations, certainly including ours, the precise loss of sovereignty that the European Union, NAFTA, and WTO have extracted from their member nations. The plan calls for all Western Hemisphere nations to submit to FTAA regulations that will harmonize business, industry, labor, agriculture, transportation, immigration, education, taxation, environment, health, trade, defense, criminal justice, and other matters, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, at the tip of South America, basically, if you don't know where that is. The FTAA agreement will launch the beginning of a regional government of progressively increasing power, first over trade matters, but then extending into ever-expanding areas of national life as well, until an independent U.S. in charge of its own destiny ceases to exist. As in Europe, this will lead to open borders, a single currency managed by a new government, additional taxation, and many more devastating consequences. Europeans who have moved further along this path are now being pressured to adopt a constitution that will consolidate even more power in Brussels at the expense of their individual nation states. At the April 2001 Quebec summit, attended by the heads of states of 34 Western Hemisphere nations, Mr. Bush approved a declaration of Quebec City containing the following wording: "We direct our ministers to ensure that negotiations of the FTAA agreement are concluded no later than January 2005 and to seek its entry into force as soon as possible thereafter, but in any case no later than December of 2005. In his January 16, 2002 address to the National Conference of the World Affairs Councils, a haven for insiders, Mr. Bush repeated his comment to the insiders' agenda. "We're working to build a free trade area of the Americas, and we're determined to complete this negotiation by January of 2005. The drive to destroy sovereignty and build world government, deceitfully cloaked with soothing rhetoric about trade benefits, proceeds accordingly." When Vice President Cheney finished speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations on February 15, 2002, top insider David Rockefeller took the opportunity to offer his follow-up comments. The retired CFR and Trilateral Commission chairman expressed great enthusiasm for Cheney's strong endorsement for the free trade agreement for all the Americas, a subject that had been a great concern to me for many years and particularly recently. Whatever David wants, insiders and insider wannabes also want. Clinton to Bush, hardly skipping a beat. Insiders know that there won't be a world government without a merging of all nations. They also know that merging all nations isn't very likely if the US and China remain avowed enemies. So there is a need, from their perspective, for China to be brought into the family of nations. Mr. Bush, like his predecessors, has worked hard to bestow legitimacy on Beijing's tyrannical rulers. China won't be forced to change politically, however. It's already a totalitarian state that needs only some economic boosting to make it mergeable. It is the US that must be made over from a constitutionally limited government to an all-powerful, centralized system that will fit nicely into the world government to be. Following in Bill Clinton's footsteps, Mr. Bush traveled across the Pacific to meet with Chinese leaders in October 2001, and he returned to the communist-controlled nation in February of 2002. He stood mute while President Jiang Zemin boasted that China provided for the freedoms of religious belief and that the religious faiths of all Chinese are protected by our Constitution. A better man would have protested, even walked away from such a bold-faced lie. Credible reports continue to stream from China about the murder and detention of Catholic, Protestant, and Falun Gong adherents, and about numerous other human rights abuses as well. And we know how that's progressed now, don't we? With their facial recognition and their social credit systems. Still in China, Mr. Bush enthused about Beijing's government and the cooperation in our war against terrorism. Even though China has supplied weaponry both to Afghanistan's Taliban regime and Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda terrorists, China is also a chief exporter of missile technology to tyrannical regimes in North Korea and in Iran, both named along with Iraq by the president himself as members of Axis of Evil. While ratcheting up the US-led and UN-authorized campaign against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, Mr. Bush welcomed Chinese leader Jiang Zemin to his Texas ranch for a barbecue. Iraq was being vilified at the time because Saddam Hussein's regime might have nuclear weapons, might have aided the 9/11 attacker, has a dismal human rights record, and had attacked neighboring nations. But China not only has nuclear weapons, her leaders have boldly stated their intention to use them against the U.S. cities should our nations interfere with Beijing's plans for Taiwan. China did supply military aid to Afghanistan's Taliban regime, which provided a safe haven for the terrorists responsible for the attacks of September 11, 2001. Her human rights record, known for its one child per family, forced abortion, infanticide, and euthanasia policies, is certainly the equal of Iraq's for its horrors. And China's decades-long rape of neighboring Tibet aims to completely destroy any vestige of Tibetan culture. Yet Mr. Bush continued to portray Iraq as the epitome of evil and China as an ally. His bowing and scraping before Chinese leaders paralleled Bill Clinton's similar conduct. The president's willingness to ignore China's crimes and focus only on Saddam Hussein's Iraq stems largely from his commitment to the insiders and their UN. While the UN never condemns China, it has issued more than a dozen resolutions targeting Iraq. Following the insider script, Mr. Bush asks Congress to approve the use of U.S. military might to enforce the UN's anti-Iraq campaign. In his September 26, 2002 message to Congress, he proclaimed that if his request were granted, it would send a clear message to the world and to the Iraqi regime. The demands of the UN Security Council must be followed. Abandoning its sole constitutional prerogative regarding declaring war, Congress meekly authorized the president to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to, 1, defend the national security in the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and 2, to enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq. Previously, Bill Clinton relied on the UN for authorization to send American forces into several of the world's hotspots. He skirted the Constitution whenever it got in the way, and he saddled the nation with economic pacts designed to compromise sovereignty. Mr. Bush has done likewise. The insider-dominated media's portrayal of George W. Bush as a conservative is a complete falsehood designed to shield his big government, debt-producing, insider-favored foreign and domestic initiatives. It also dulls resistance to the harm being done among those who might ordinarily be expected to challenge such unconstitutional and dangerous programs. More Clinton-like actions are easily seen by anyone who looks behind the media-provided labeling. The president's enormous 2003 budget led even the arch-liberal Washington Post to comment, "Spending on annually funded programs in inflation-adjusted dollars rose about 9% in the last 2 years of the Clinton administration and is scheduled to grow nearly 15% in the first 2 years of the Bush administration." The estimate, of course, appeared before the huge outlays needed for the Iraq War could be taken into account. Liberty Magazine's Chris Edwards chipped in with another criticism of the Bush budget because it includes tough talk about federal programs that don't work. He wrote, "Health and Human Services, Amtrak, farm subsidies, the Department of Education, these are all bloated, ill-performing, useless, destructive, or unconstitutional federal programs whose budgets George W. Bush isn't trying to increase, while for Americans continuing to hear the president described as a strong conservative, it's questionable." After he signed a bill containing an enormous increase in the Department of Education spending, Mr. Bush warmly praised the measure's Senate sponsor, arch-liberal Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts. "Mr. Senator," gushed the president at a joint Boston appearance, "not only are you a good senator, you're a good man." And Kennedy, who never disagreed with any proposal offered by Bill Clinton, responded by delightfully informing the assembled Bostonians of the differences he has made, having George Bush in the White House. Can you still maintain that George W. Bush is a conservative? Obviously, Kennedy doesn't believe he is. Other George Bush policies forcing many to think Bill Clinton is still in office include increased funding for the National Endowment of the Arts, more foreign aid, refusal to employ an abortion litmus test when selecting Supreme Court nominees, a continuation on the Clinton-era ban on semi-automatic weapons, and boosting campaign finance reform legislation designed to restrict free speech after firmly promising he would never do so. In 1966, Carroll Quigley said the two parties should be almost identical so that the government by an elitist secret society could proceed without interruption, and that is certainly has been the record of the last several decades. So this is essentially the author's summary. In our first edition of The Insiders 1979, we supplied hard truths about insider domination of our nation's government and major institutions. At the time, there was little public awareness that such a conspiratorial clique even existed, much less that its destructive agenda was being followed. Happily, many more Americans now understand that limited government, of the people, by the people, and for the people, has been subverted by a gang of insiders determined to destroy freedom and establish an all-powerful world government. While we can rejoice at this accomplishment, it is not nearly enough to stop the insiders and recover working control of our government. A great deal more awareness must be created, and the time to do so is running out. One excellent way to assess freedom's tenuous existence today is to consider that if the insiders are to succeed in having the UN rule mankind, the world body needs only a few additional powers, none of which were remotely attainable 25 years ago, but each of which is either being provided or enthusiastically championed by insiders today. To be specific, the additional powers sought by the UN include 1. Military. In recent years, U.S. forces assigned to NATO have become a military arm for the UN. The insiders made known their ultimate desire to equip the UN with a military force in the 1961 and 1962 documents cited earlier. While this goal is still being sought, NATO personnel and equipment have been made available for a variety of UN missions. American troops weren't wearing blue helmets and patches during operations in the former Yugoslavia or the war against Iraq, but the authorization for their action came from the UN. 2. Taxation. In March 2002, the UN hosted its own Conference of Financing for Development in Monterrey, Mexico. Various proposals for forcing wealthy nations to supply funds for the underdeveloped world were accompanied by a renewed drive for global taxation that would fund the world body directly and automatically. If the UN overcomes the need to seek funds from member nations, it will also overcome the need to listen to those nations. The sovereignty of all nations would thereby be threatened as never before. 3. Judicial authority. On April 11, 2002, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan proudly announced, "The long-held dream of the International Criminal Court will now be realized. Fraudulently presented as an agency independent of the UN, the ICC arrogantly claims jurisdiction over every person on earth and the power to prosecute anyone it accuses of genocide, war crimes, or crimes against humanity. These loosely defined offenses ensure that virtually anyone could be targeted. Moreover, the plan is to add more crimes to the ICC's jurisdiction in the future, such as crimes against the environment, crimes against labor, crimes against children, crimes against women, and especially crimes against government or dissent. Any American brought before the ICC tribunal will not enjoy the rights guaranteed by the Bill of Rights or our nation's Constitution. More ominously, ICC partisans claim that if a nation will harmonize its laws to conform to those of the ICC and prosecute its own nationals in its own courts, a process dubbed complementary, then there would be no need for the ICC to act. The Bush administration's unsigning of the ICC treaty is not a permanent barrier preventing judicial activists from reshaping our nation's courts and laws to conform to UN law. 4. Civil disarmament. For years, the UN has worked to disarm nations. Our own leaders abide by the US-created disarmament programs known as Freedom from War and a world effectively controlled by the United Nations. But the UN is also determined to disarm civilians, especially Americans. The actual existence of this totalitarian-minded program has been resoundingly exposed by William Norman Grigg in his small but extremely important book, Global Gun Grab, the United Nations Campaign to Disarm Americans. The administration, presided over by George W. Bush and largely managed by Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and other insider veterans, has been painted as the very epitome of conservatism. The president benefits enormously from the theft of this word and its once clear meaning. Deceivers in government and the mass media have fastened this label to an un-American internationalism and big government socialism. The standard for Americans must never be an ill-defined, undefined, or shifting conservatism. It must be the Constitution, adherence to which all government officials formally pledge themselves. If the Constitution were honored as it should be, the harm to our country, chronicled in these pages, would never have occurred. There is only one national organization formed to combat the insiders' organization of our nation and to drive the delivery of America to the United Nations. This is the John Birch Society. The society campaigns get us out of the United Nations, and if successful, it will strike a death blow to the conspiratorial apparatus built by the insiders. If you value your freedom for yourself and your loved ones, you should contact the Society and learn about its unique program. Once you understand what the John Birch Society is doing, you will have found the way to preserve the American dream and to bring about a new era of less government, more responsibility, and with God's help, a better world. I'd like to thank you for joining me for the Insiders, Architects of the New World Order by John F. McManus. These 5 chapters that we've reviewed are a glimpse of presidencies past that have ushered us into where we are today. Politically and economically and just overall globally, these agendas and actions have been set forth far beyond the presidencies that we've reviewed, and they go way, way back into 1919 and over the past 100 years and more. So with this, the insiders, there's a couple of things that I want to say. First of all, when President Bush was discussing his American internationalism, there cannot be one and the same. That is an oxymoronical statement. Because if you are an American and you believe in sovereignty, then you are someone who believes that the Americans should have the right to police themselves, have closed borders, live within the constitutional guidelines, and be free in all senses of the word. If you are an internationalist, you are a globalist. You can still be a global thinker, but if you are a socialist, then you are someone who believes in open borders and one world government and the New World Order. However, I want you to keep in mind that socialism never works. And if you can't see the bigger picture here of how it's not just better for one, it's worse for all, then the only ones that benefit from this are the social elitists, the power grabbers, the money-hungry, green-eyed monsters who ultimately it's the same group of people with the control and the 1% who have set this in place for future generations, for their future generations. And right now, it's just their lineage that we see in operation of this control scheme. So for us as American citizens, we have to stand up for America and for our sovereign value. The reason that I will be voting for Donald Trump, now in the last election, I didn't vote for either of those parties. There were 15 people on the ballot and I researched all of them and I gave my vote to the one who's my views most aligned with. So at this point, I believe that it will be one or the other. And I have to go and give my vote to the republic for which it stands. Right now, if we don't support that, we will lose that forever. And it is our most precious gift. So be well. Thank you for joining me and have a good day. Just Christina.